Well, welcome to our now independent study, English 5913, Early American Women Writers. Had a little bit of a change in our format because we had a couple of students who weren't able to follow through and join us and be part of our class for various reasons, which is okay. But we do have a bit of a change in the format for the class, and I wanted to kick off this first discussion which I believe is probably going to be 2 videos here, and we'll see how I end up on time. I'm limited in terms of my ability to post up to YouTube. I have to cut these videos short. Some students think that's rather merciful on YouTube's part, not having to listen to me for a solid hour or so. But I'm going to talk here briefly about our format and then also dive into the first couple of readings. We had a traditional online course format scheduled and arranged, and all of our assignments and all of our discussions and activities and readings are all going to be the same, with a minor change that I want to make because it is an independent study course at this stage, and that means I need to follow sort of the intentions and the goals and objectives of an independent study. So it's a little bit of a different sort of format that I'm going to follow, and I'll tell you how that is. We're going to be doing postings, both you all, the students that are doing the independent study, and yours truly, your instructor. With my postings, what I'm going to do is I'm going to be focusing each week on a set of readings, and I'm going to be posting YouTube discussions wherein my purpose is not to offer a thorough and comprehensive lecture on each reading, but rather to highlight what I think are major issues, challenges, or critical questions with the texts that we have assigned for that week. In other words, I'm not going to go through each text each week in each video with a fine-tooth comb and offer just this very extensive lecture. Instead, this is a graduate course, it's an independent study graduate course, and instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, hey, look, here's a text that's on our reading list for this week. I want to point out 1 or 2 or the big sort of things that you might want to take a look at. Sometimes there are things that everybody's recognized about the work, sort of classic questions or issues about the text, problematic things that everybody's already pointed to, or maybe it's just something that has always interested or intrigued me about the text, something that I think people might have overlooked, or something that deserves, I think, some additional attention. So that's what I'm going to be doing each week. So we have a set of readings. I'm a little bit behind at this stage. I realize that. I'll be doing another discussion posting on YouTube late in this week. And we'll be doing the readings, and then I will post my videos where I do that with the readings for the week. And then what I want to ask each of you to do, there are at this stage 4 of us, 4 of you, I should say, is I would like for each of you to select a reading, not all of them, just a reading, or in a longer work, an aspect of that longer work, and hold forth on a single semester-long discussion thread that I'm going to establish in our Blackboard class site, and in that, just some aspect that you found interesting about the text. About 200 words-ish, something like that. You don't want to go too long, but you don't want it to be just some sort of brief little paragraph either. So take an element, an aspect, maybe of a poem, and say, I really was very interested in the imagery that this poet was using because here's what I think is going on. Or here's an episode in the novel, and it's something that caught my eye, and here are my musings. And that's all it needs to be, is just your thoughts, your musings. It needn't be some, formal thesis putting forward an argument backed up with... It would be interesting for us all to be able to see your thought processes, don't get me wrong, but I'm not expecting it to be a formal critical analysis or anything like that. So what I want you to do is we'll begin this next week, our week 2, our discussion 2, our posting 2, when we're dealing with some of the other works. I'll tell you how to do that in an email. But essentially, what I want you to do is find a work or an aspect of a longer work and give us your thoughts, your musings, your interpretations. Give us some sense of how you arrived at that. It's just kind of, consider it free writing if you want to, but it needs to have some form to it. It needs to have some sense to it. Consider it your opportunity to have the floor for a few minutes. How about that? And tell us what you think of a particular work. Now, it could be that we all get interested in the same passage or the same work or the same episode. It's kind of unlikely, I'm going to guess, but if we do, we do, and that's okay. My guess is that we're not all going to see things the same way. So what I want to do is I want to begin with Bradstreet for our first selections, and then the next video I'll do Rowlandson. And what I want to kind of highlight for you for Bradstreet is, you read the head note and everything, and many of you already probably know a little bit about Bradstreet and her Puritan background. If you don't, then you can do a little research on your own about her Puritan background. Some basic Puritan concepts everybody ought to know: doctrine of election, Calvinism, providence, the belief in providence, these kinds of things. If you don't know all that, just go read a thumbnail sketch on it. It'll fill in a lot of blanks, and it'll also explain a lot of things about Bradstreet's poetry and her approach to things. I think make it a little bit clearer. What I want to do in this particular with this particular selection, particularly the prologue to the 10th Muse, is I've always been intrigued by what she's up to in terms of her rhetorical strategy, and I think that this poem presents for us kind of a setup. I think she's setting up her readers, both male and female, in some regards, and there's a real strategy here. A lot of different things that are interesting about the poem. Number one, of course, if you believe, pardon me, I'm still getting over this, but if you believe for 1 minute that her brother-in-law sort of absconded with her poems without her knowledge, ran off to London and published them because he just knew his sister-in-law would never stand for having her work published, being the modest and Puritan woman she is, and that when he had done so, she was appalled and just mortified that someone had taken her poetry and put it in print. Oh, dear heavens. If you believe that, I've got a bridge to sell you. I don't believe it. I never have believed it. I've always thought that was a ruse that she concocted with Woodbridge, her brother-in-law, who ran off to London and published it. This prologue is, of course, an introductory poem to essentially the second edition of this collection of her poetry. I think it was hard for a woman to be published as a poet. I mean, she says so in the prologue in some respects. And it serves as a kind of an apology, and not apology as in apologizing, but an apology as in an explanation. It was traditional in the Renaissance and in the 17th century, particularly for a religious writer, to sort of begin with an oh, my work isn't that great, and let me explain, I'm not quite so good as anybody else, etc. And she certainly does that in the prologue, but I have to wonder whether or not this isn't really kind of a setup. I want you to look at some of the stanzas here. She follows this strategy of what we call diminished expectations. She wants you to not see her as a great poet. And she wants to keep reminding you, I'm not a great poet. I never said I was. I mean, I didn't even want to publish these myself. My brother-in-law ran off with them. I've never thought I was a great poet. That's important because she doesn't want to seem egotistical. She doesn't want to seem cocky. And of course, as a woman, she's got to be very careful that she not step outside of what at that time was considered her boundaries as a woman. Look at stanza 3. From schoolboy's tongue no rhetoric we expect, nor yet a sweet consort from broken strings, nor perfect beauty wears a main defect. My foolish, broken, blemished muse so sings, and this to mend, alas, no art is able, 'cause nature made it so irreparable. Right? In other words, she says, look, we don't expect great poetry from schoolboys. We don't expect a broken instrument to give great music. We don't expect great beauty in something that has a major defect. So don't expect great things from me. I'm not a great poet. I never claimed to be. And I even think that last couplet, she intentionally made it a really awful groaner of a line. Able and irreparable. That's a horrible rhyme. I think it's an intentional flaw here. So she's trying to diminish the expectations. Nor can I, like that fluent, sweet-tongued Greek who lisped at first, in future times speak plain. I'm just not really good, etc. But where we get to the meat of the matter is in stanza 5. She says, I am obnoxious to each carping tongue who says my hand a needle better fits, right? You should put your pen down and pick up your knitting needles, lady. A poet's pen all scorn I should thus wrong, for such despite they cast on female wits. Wits just means intelligence. Okay, in essence. If what I prove do well, it won't advance. They'll say it's stolen, or else it was by chance. In other words, she says, I'm in a no-win situation. If I do well, they say, you stole it, or you lucked out, you wrote a few good lines. Anybody can write a few lucky lines, right? But if I don't do well, people say, see, she's a woman, she can't do very well. So she says, I'm in a no-win situation. So she starts off by saying, argument A, I never said I was good. I'm really not that good. Argument B, even if I end up being good, you're going to say it's luck, so I kind of can't win either way. So stanza 6, she says, but sure the antique Greeks were far more mild, else of our sex why feigned they those 9? Now she has to say they were feigned, the muses, right? Because she can't agree with pagans that muses actually exist. It has to be imaginary. So all the muses are female, is what she's saying, and even the Greeks were more generous to women than we are today, because they made the muses female. And poesy made Calliope's own child, so amongst the rest they placed the arts divine. But this weak knot they will full soon untie. The Greeks did not but play the fool and lie. Right? So I can't even point to the Greeks and say, look at these Greeks. They were pagans and they even appreciated women better than we Christians do today. Well, that's because Greeks were stupid and they were pagans and they were backwards and they were fools. So I can't even point to classical examples for my... So look at what she's doing. She's really building the case here that take my poetry not terribly seriously, but seriously somewhat. But here is where I think in stanza 7, she gets very aggressive in her argument. So, I never said my poetry's good. Even if it ends up being good, a lot of people are going to say I lucked out or I stole it, right? I plagiarized. People don't really appreciate women's writings because, we don't even appreciate it as much as the Greeks did. And the Greeks at least appreciated women and their influence in the arts, and we don't. We're supposed to be more advanced than they are, more modern than they are. But in stanza 7, she even really gets a dig in that I think is very interesting. And I don't think this gets anywhere near enough critical attention. They just kind of say, well, Anne Bradstreet, first sort of feminist poet. Well, I don't know if she is or not. You'll have to decide that. I'd be interested in hearing what you think. She says, let Greeks be Greeks and women what they are. Men have precedency and still excel. It is but vain unjustly to wage war. Men can do best, and women know it well. Preeminence in all and each is yours, yet grant some small acknowledgement of ours. So, some people read this and say, see, she's no feminist. She genuinely and sincerely believes that men have greater intellects and are greater writers and greater thinkers and greater poets. Others say, well, now hold on a minute. Maybe this bowing and scraping is with tongue in cheek, because in stanza 8 she says, and oh, ye high-flown quills that soar the skies, and ever with your prey still catch your praise, if e'er you deign these lowly lines, your eyes, give thyme or parsley wreath, I ask no bays. This mean and unrefined ore of mine will make your glistering gold but more to shine. In other words, oh, you great men, you wonderful writers, you're so superior intellectually and so superior artistically. Why would you be afraid of reading a woman's poetry? I mean, it only makes yours look better, unless, of course, you're threatened by that and are worried that your poetry won't look as good as mine. She doesn't actually say that way, but what she leaves unsaid, what she leaves implied is really interesting. Why are you so threatened by a woman's poetry? Because I've told you I think men are better writers. Well, of course they are. Well, everyone knows this, of course. You're all so much better. You're so smart. So why in the world would you why would you bother criticizing a woman's writing? Why would you bother being worried about whether I was a good writer or not? I mean, if you really are confident that men are better writers. It's a wonderfully crafted argument, I think, and it never gets, I think, the attention it deserves. Is she or is she not a feminist? Oh, good heavens. We could argue for days what feminism is. You decide. It's up to you. I'm going to let you guys weigh in on this if you choose to do so. But by golly, you've got to say, I don't think she wrote this without a little bit of irony in her tone. One thing that we do want to talk about a little bit here with Bradstreet especially is this importance of this doctrine of election. You know, as a Puritan, they believed that your salvation was something that God knew from the get-go, that some were elect and some were not. You would not know your eternal destiny, but God always does. Doesn't mean you don't have free will. It's just God knows which way you're going to choose. You still get to choose, but God knows which way you're going to choose. I'm not going to turn this into a theology lesson on Calvinism, but you get the idea, right? But what's interesting is that what you see played out in some of Bradstreet's other poems here, especially when she's dealing with tragedy, especially when she's dealing with her house, the burning of her house, the death of her daughter, her granddaughter, that is, her granddaughter Elizabeth, which is not among our selections, but it's there. She has to reconcile the idea that God is in control and that God is good and divine, and that God knows our choices and knows what we're going to do, with the idea that bad things happen to people who are genuinely and sincerely trying to follow the will of that God who is good. In other words, it's the age-old question. Why do bad things happen to apparently good people? And there's just no indication that Bradstreet wasn't just a wonderfully decent human being and a sincere and devout person. Whether you agree with her religious convictions or not, I don't think there's any question that she was very sincere and she took it very much to heart and tried to be a good person. So, at least in her own mind, while she was, I'm certain, very self-critical about her flaws, you know, as a person who says, look, I give it everything I've got and bad things still happen to me, what does this mean? You know, a Puritan would believe very sincerely that everything that happens to you, and I mean everything, every small detail, is something that is God's divine providence. I mean, you may wonder why, you know, you had a fender bender this morning, but God doesn't. He knew it was going to happen, and it happened for a reason. Everything happens for a reason. You cut yourself shaving in the morning. It happened for a reason. And so a Puritan would spend their entire lives reflecting on, what does this mean? What does the fact that this happened to me mean? They took that quite literally out of the Bible, the idea that God was in control of everything and knew everything, etc. And so when a tragic thing happens, like the burning of her house, she has to ask questions about it. So there's this strong belief in providence, but there's also this strong sense of stoicism. Take a look at, this doesn't have stanzas, unfortunately, but it's about the 10th or 12th line here, where she says, the flame consume my dwelling, then coming out beheld a space, the flame consume my dwelling space, and when I could no longer look, I blessed his name that gave and took, that laid my goods now in the dust, yea, so it was, and so 'twas just. It was his own, it was not mine. You can read that several ways. You can say, boy, what a great Puritan she was. By golly, didn't bother me. Burn my house down. It's the Lord's anyway. It's not my property. But underneath that, there's a very human tone of voice, if you read it the right way, that says, gee, it must have been hard for her to come to that conclusion. It would be for me. You know, even if you're a very devout believer, to have to reconcile, because you have to understand what a home meant for a woman then. That it was her domain. It was her sphere. It was an expression of who she was. It was the dwelling place. It wasn't just a place to live. It was who she was, especially a woman of some means and property and standing in the community like Anne Bradstreet. And think of the fact that they built these homes at that time in the early 1600s from basically woods, forest, nothing. I mean, it was in the early years, it was basically just mud huts almost. I mean, these people they scratched and clawed to make some sort of something that looked like a civilized house from back in the old country. Would never have compared. And so what little she had, what little and how modest and primitive, one would even say, she had, she took pride in. And it wasn't just a home. It was the place that housed her family, her life, her whole temporal existence is wrapped up in a house. Men still kind of don't get that today. I mean, my wife and I, it's like, it's just a house. To me, I always say houses are just sticks, bricks, and dirt. But for my wife, it's like, no, it's not. It's filled with memories. It's filled with family. It's, there are all these things, emotional and spiritual things that are wrapped up in it. It's an expression of who she is as a person. And, we've progressed in a lot of ways, but there's still some things there, I think, with especially a lot of women that see their homes that way. And certainly that would have been that way 400 years ago. Think about how different they are even from us today, and how very much tied into sort of expected gender roles they were then, right? But it's an expression of who she is. A house is a repository of family experiences. It's a gathering place. And she even says this, my pleasant things in ashes lie, and them behold no more shall I. Under thy roof no guest shall sit, nor at thy table eat a bit. No pleasant talk shall e'er be told, nor things recounted done of old. No candle e'er shall shine in thee, no bridegroom's voice e'er heard shall be. People got married in homes in that day. The Puritans never married in churches. Most people didn't marry in churches. They married in people's homes. And so, she's conjuring up all these things that aren't going to happen there. All the memories that aren't going to happen there anymore. And it's a huge loss. It's grieving for a place. And, okay, I'll be honest. I'm a dude. It's like, it's a house. Get over it. But boy, that's just not true. Not for some men, but for a lot of women also. It's a real reflection of the emotional and family investment that they've made. Into that place. It stands for a lot. It symbolizes a lot. It has depth and meaning to her. And this is huge because it's just been ripped away. The very symbol of who she is as a woman has been ripped away and just demolished, leveled, burned, razed to the ground. And she's got to reconcile why this happened. And she's got to come to terms. And I think she probably, as I read the poem, I think she means it, but it probably took her a while to mean it when she says, there's wealth enough, I need no more. Farewell, my pelf, which means my property. Farewell, my store. The world no longer let me love. My hope and treasure lies above. It probably took her a while to get to that. I don't doubt her. I think she does believe that, but she probably had to tell herself that a lot before she actually came to accept it. Very difficult thing. Last word here on the poem To My Dear and Loving Husband. There's a couple more that we kind of skipped over, but we don't have a lot of time. Bradstreet had a great relationship with her husband. She had a very loving, dear, sweet, warm relationship. He was several years older than she was. She got married when she was 16. Both of them were highly educated individuals. She was the daughter of the fellow who managed the estate of the Earl of Lincoln, which was basically being like the Earl of Lincoln's CEO of his property and estate. So she had access to the Earl of Lincoln's library, and so there's great evidence in her writings that she was very much exposed to Shakespeare, Ben Jonson, Christopher Marlowe, and all the great writers of the Renaissance. She was a Renaissance woman, to be honest with you, or at least as a young girl, she was a Renaissance person. And so when she married her husband at age 16, and he was several years older, it was by all accounts of her choosing, and she never looked back, and she had a deep and fond regard. A lot of the poems that she wrote, and I believe there are some letters still left, he used to have to travel a lot. She missed him dearly when he was on the road, and they had a great relationship. If ever two were one, then surely we. If ever man were loved by wife, then thee. If ever wife was happy in a man, compare with me, ye women, if you can. I prize thy love more than whole mines of gold, or all the riches that the east doth hold. I think you can read that and say it was sincere. I don't think this was artifice on her part. The last two lines are really worth looking at. Then while we love, in love let's so persever, that when we live no more, we may live ever. That's really interesting and very orthodox Puritanism. Love in this world, in this life, marriage in this life, is for now. Romantic love does not extend to the next life. Your job, your role as a married person is to be a support, a love, a comfort, a helper to your spouse. And when we die, that role is now done. You see, we're not going to go on kissing and making out in heaven, right? Not going to happen. Doesn't have a need, right? It's very rational. The Puritans were very rational. Why do you have romantic love? Because romantic love spawn, okay, to be quite blunt about it, and there ain't no need for babies in the heavens. While we love, in this earth, we will be romantically in love, emotionally attached. In love, let's so persevere, right? That's the job of marriage. We persevere through this life, right? We are a support and a comfort to each other. That when we live no more, we may live ever. The purpose of marriage is to help us get each other, support each other on our way through this lifetime journey so that we may arrive in heaven later. We need to help each other get to heaven and be a support to each other. And then the marriage is done, right? It doesn't extend beyond this life. So it's quite an interesting thing. I think it's interesting to look at Bradstreet and ask, how do her core religious beliefs inform her art, the events in her life, her relationships, because they're really interesting if you look at her that way. Next, we're going to do Rowlandson in the part 2 of this week's discussion on early American women writers, so be sure to watch the second video as well.